They accused me of stealing and fired me like I was nothing more than dirt beneath their polished Italian leather shoes. The words still echo through my mind, sharp, cold, final. But when Charles Morrison, that millionaire with ice blue eyes, finally looked into mine that day, something shifted in the marble hallway of his Fifth Avenue penthouse, something he hadn't expected to see. Maybe you're cooking dinner right now for someone who never says thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise, today's story will move you. I'm 72 years old now, and my hands still remember the weight of that last morning in their kitchen. The dawn light was seeping through those enormous windows, the kind that rich people have installed to remind you how small you are compared to their view of Central Park. I was standing at the marble island, my fingers deep in flour and butter, making my signature apple turnovers for the Morrison family's Sunday brunch. The cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air like a warm embrace, but the house around me felt colder than a January morning in Manhattan. The kitchen was my sanctuary in that glass palace. For 15 years, I had risen before the sun to fill those sterile rooms with the aroma of home-cooked love. Every morning at 4:30, my alarm would pierce the darkness of my tiny studio apartment in Queens, and I would take the subway into Manhattan, carrying my worn leather recipe book and a heart full of hope that today, maybe today, someone would notice the care I poured into every meal. But Charles Morrison noticed very little beyond his stock portfolios and cryptocurrency investments. His fortune, built on decades of real estate deals and strategic financial moves, had grown into something so vast it seemed to swallow everything warm and human around him. I heard him on phone calls sometimes, discussing millions of dollars in Bitcoin transactions like other people talked about buying groceries. His wealth was measured not just in the penthouse that occupied an entire floor, but in properties scattered across Manhattan, investments in emerging markets, and a portfolio that his financial advisors managed like pieces on a chessboard. His wife, Eleanor, was cut from the same expensive cloth. She moved through their home like a cold breeze, never quite seeing the woman who prepared her organic, locally sourced meals with hands that had been cooking since before she was born. To Eleanor, I was just another household expense, like the electric bill or the maintenance fees on their art collection. She would glide past me in her designer dresses, speaking to her friends on the phone about their latest acquisitions. Never people, always things. Stocks, bonds, real estate, jewelry. Everything had a price tag, including me. But there were moments, small, precious moments, when their grandchildren would slip into the kitchen while I was cooking. Little Emma, with her gap-toothed smile, would climb onto the step stool beside me and ask what magic I was putting into the cookies. 7-year-old Michael would steal warm dinner rolls when he thought no one was looking, his eyes bright with innocent joy. They called me Grandma Rose when their parents weren't listening, and those whispered words were worth more than all of Charles Morrison's millions. I had come to New York from a small town in Ohio when I was 57, after my husband passed and left me with nothing but memories and a mortgage I couldn't afford. My daughter had seen the job posting, private chef needed for affluent Manhattan family, and encouraged me to apply. "Mom," she said, "you've been cooking with love your whole life. It's time someone paid you for it." The interview had been brief and cold. Charles barely looked up from his financial newspapers while Eleanor asked me sterile questions about dietary restrictions and meal planning. They hired me not because they saw my passion or tasted my grandmother's secret recipe for beef stew, but because I quoted a salary lower than the previous chef. I was grateful then. I needed the job, needed the steady income, needed to feel useful again after decades of cooking for a family that had scattered to the winds. For the first few years, I poured my heart into every meal. I learned their preferences, adapted my Ohio comfort food to their Manhattan sophistication, and slowly began to understand the rhythm of their lives. Charles made his fortune by being ruthless in business, buying low and selling high, investing in startups that became gold mines and cryptocurrency ventures that multiplied his assets beyond imagination. His daily routine involved checking stock market reports over breakfast, conference calls about international investments during lunch, and business dinners where million-dollar deals were sealed between the soup and salad courses. But money, I learned, doesn't warm a house the way a pot of homemade soup does. It doesn't create memories the way the smell of fresh bread can. And it certainly doesn't fill the hollow spaces in your heart the way a simple thank you from someone you've nourished can. I remember the first time Charles hurt me with his words. It was a Tuesday morning, and I had spent hours preparing his favorite breakfast. Eggs Benedict with a hollandaise sauce that required patience and constant attention. He took one bite, frowned, and pushed the plate away. "This is too rich," he said without looking at me. "Anyone can follow a recipe. I expect better." The words hit me like a slap. Not because he criticized my cooking, I had faced picky eaters before, but because he reduced 15 years of culinary experience, decades of perfecting techniques passed down through generations, to something any person could do by following instructions on a card. I stood there in my worn apron, my gray hair pinned back, feeling invisible and worthless. Eleanor was worse. She had a way of looking through me, as if I were transparent. When I would ask about preferences for dinner parties, she would answer while checking her phone, her voice flat and dismissive. "Whatever you think is fine," she would say, but then complain to her friends later if the menu didn't impress. I overheard her once, describing me to a visitor as adequate, like I was a kitchen appliance that functioned well enough but wasn't particularly noteworthy. The physical demands of the job grew harder as I aged. My arthritis made chopping vegetables painful, especially during New York's harsh winters. My back ached from standing for hours, preparing elaborate meals for their social gatherings. But what hurt more than my joints was the emotional exhaustion of being treated as if I didn't exist. I was the ghost who made their food appear, who cleaned their messes, who absorbed their complaints and expectations without ever being seen as a human being with feelings, dreams, and dignity. Some mornings I would stand in that kitchen before dawn, looking out at the city lights, and wonder what had become of my life. I had raised 3 children, nursed my husband through his final illness, volunteered at church suppers, and brought joy to countless family gatherings with my cooking. Now I was just a shadow in someone else's life, cooking for people who saw me as an expense line in their household budget. But I endured because I needed the job, because at 70 years old, starting over seemed impossible, and because those moments with Emma and Michael reminded me why I had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. Food is love made visible. It's comfort wrapped in warmth. It's the way we take care of each other when words aren't enough. Charles's business empire continued to grow during my years there. I would see headlines in the newspapers he left scattered around. Morrison Holdings acquires downtown property complex. Real estate mogul's Bitcoin investment yields massive returns. Cryptocurrency pioneer expands international portfolio. His net worth climbed into the hundreds of millions, with investments spanning from traditional stocks and bonds to cutting-edge digital currencies. He owned buildings, owned companies, owned pieces of the future through his technology investments. Yet for all his wealth, he owned nothing that mattered. His children visited dutifully but briefly during holidays, their conversations stilted and formal. Eleanor spent her days shopping and socializing with other wealthy wives, their friendships based on social status rather than genuine connection. The penthouse, despite its multi-million-dollar value and stunning views, felt as empty as a museum after hours. I watched Charles sometimes, during quiet moments when he thought no one was looking. He would stand by those massive windows, staring out at Central Park, his shoulders carrying a weight that money couldn't lift. Success had cost him something precious, the ability to connect, to feel, to receive love instead of just accumulating assets. His portfolio might have been diversified across multiple markets and currencies, but his emotional life was bankrupt. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who could buy anything in the world, and there was I, a woman with less than $5,000 in savings, and yet I was the one who knew how to create warmth, how to nurture, how to make a house feel like home. My wealth wasn't measured in dollars or euros or Bitcoin. It was measured in the smiles I could create with a perfect pie, the comfort I could offer with a steaming bowl of soup on a cold day, the memories I could build with recipes passed down through generations. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever poured your heart into something only to have it dismissed as ordinary? I know many of you listening have experienced this. You've cooked for families who forgot to say thank you. You've cleaned up after celebrations you weren't invited to join. You've given your time, your energy, your love, and received only indifference in return. The breaking point came on a gray March morning. I had been with the Morrison family for 15 years, and Eleanor was hosting one of her elaborate charity fundraisers, the kind where wealthy women write large checks and feel good about themselves while eating expensive canapes. She had insisted on hiring a famous chef from one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants to cater the event, despite my years of successful parties. "We need something more sophisticated," she explained, not even looking at me as she spoke. "This is for the Metropolitan Museum benefit. We can't serve comfort food." I stood in my kitchen, and watched strangers take over my space. The celebrity chef, Marcus something or other with his perfectly styled hair and expensive knife roll, looked at my equipment with barely concealed disdain. He moved my carefully organized spice rack, criticized my outdated techniques, and treated me like I was in his way. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked with a smirk, examining one of my worn wooden spoons. "Community college." "From my mother," I replied quietly, "and her mother before that." He laughed, actually laughed, as if learning to cook from family was some kind of joke. "Well, we're going to need some real equipment here. This looks like someone's grandmother's kitchen." Someone's grandmother. That's exactly what it was, and exactly what I was. But he said it like it was something shameful, something less than his culinary school credentials and celebrity status. I felt a familiar sting in my chest, the same feeling I got every time Charles or Eleanor dismissed my efforts. The event was a success, according to Eleanor's standards. The wealthy guests praised the innovative menu, took photos for their social media accounts, and wrote generous checks for the museum. I helped serve, invisible in my black uniform, carrying trays and clearing plates, while Marcus received compliments and business cards from potential new clients. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that food without love is just expensive ingredients arranged on pretty plates. The guests ate politely, but without the joy I saw when Emma bit into one of my cookies, or the satisfaction Michael got from my homemade mac and cheese. They consumed Marcus's art, but they didn't feel nourished by it. After the last guest left and the catering staff packed up their equipment, I stayed to clean the kitchen they had left in chaos. Eleanor found me there at nearly midnight, scrubbing surfaces that sparkled but somehow felt cold. "The evening was perfect," she said, and for a moment I thought she might actually thank me for my help. Instead, she continued, "Marcus said he might be available for our summer parties. It would be nice to have someone with real training handle our entertaining." Real training. As if 30 years of feeding families, comforting the sick with homemade chicken soup, and creating joy through food wasn't real. As if the love I poured into every dish was somehow less valuable than a diploma hanging on a restaurant wall. I nodded and continued scrubbing, but something inside me was breaking. Not breaking like glass shatters, but breaking like ice cracks. Slowly, with quiet pressure, until suddenly there's no going back. 3 weeks later, my world collapsed completely. I was in the kitchen early, as always, preparing Charles's morning coffee and Eleanor's gluten-free toast when Charles appeared in the doorway, his face dark with anger. Behind him stood Eleanor and their daughter Patricia, who managed the household finances and rarely spoke to me directly. "Rose," Charles said, his voice sharp as broken glass, "we need to discuss something with you." I set down the coffee pot, my hands suddenly trembling. The tone in his voice made my stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. Patricia stepped forward, holding something in her manicured hand. "This was found in your apron pocket during yesterday's laundry service." She opened her palm to reveal Eleanor's diamond tennis bracelet, the one worth more than I had made in 3 years of working for them. The stones caught the morning light and threw tiny rainbows across the marble countertop, beautiful and damning. "I don't understand," I whispered, staring at the bracelet like it was a snake about to bite me. "I've never seen that before." "It's been missing for 2 weeks," Eleanor said, her voice cold as January wind. "We've torn the house apart looking for it." "But I didn't take it," I said, my voice growing stronger despite my fear. "I would never steal from you. Never." Charles's ice blue eyes fixed on mine, and I saw no warmth there, no doubt, no willingness to believe in my innocence. 15 years of loyal service, of early mornings and late nights, of caring for his grandchildren and making his house a home. All of it meant nothing in the face of a diamond bracelet in my apron pocket. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said. "Patricia, call security to escort Rose out. I don't want her taking anything else." The world tilted around me. Security? As if I were some common criminal instead of the woman who had made his coffee every morning for 15 years. As if I hadn't earned the right to at least be heard, to have my word considered against the circumstantial evidence of jewelry I had never touched. "Please," I said, and hated how my voice sounded, small and desperate. "I don't know how that got there, but I didn't take it. You know me. You know I would never—" "I know you needed money," Charles interrupted. "Patricia showed me the records. You've been behind on your rent 3 times this year. Your daughter had medical bills. People do desperate things when they're financially pressured." He had been watching my finances, monitoring my life like I was an investment that might go bad. The violation of it, the cold calculation in reducing my struggles to a motive for theft, made me feel sick. But he wasn't wrong about my financial troubles. My daughter Sarah had been battling cancer, and even with insurance, the medical bills were crushing. I had been sending her every spare dollar, skipping meals sometimes to make sure I could help with her treatments. Charles, with his millions in stocks and cryptocurrency investments, his diversified portfolio worth more than some small country's GDP, had reduced my love for my daughter to a criminal motive. "I need this job," I said, tears starting to blur my vision. "But I would never steal from you. Please, just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Eleanor said, her voice as sharp as her diamond bracelet. "The theft is obvious. What's obvious is that we can no longer trust you in our home." Security arrived. 2 men in expensive suits who treated me like I was dangerous instead of a 72-year-old woman whose world was crumbling. They watched as I removed my apron, the one I had worn proudly for 15 years, and placed it on the marble counter where I had created so many meals with love. I walked through that penthouse for the last time, past the dining room where Emma and Michael had laughed over my pancakes, past the windows that looked out over Central Park, past the life I had built from scratch in someone else's home. The security guards flanked me like I might suddenly sprint for the door with stolen art under my arms. At the entrance, Charles appeared one final time. "Your final paycheck will be mailed," he said, not meeting my eyes. "And Rose, don't use us as a reference." The elevator doors closed on my old life, and I found myself alone in the marble lobby, holding nothing but my worn purse and the weight of accusations I couldn't shake. 15 years of service, of dedication, of love poured into every meal, reduced to a moment of suspicion and a bracelet I had never touched. The doorman, who had greeted me every morning with a smile for 15 years, avoided my eyes as I walked past. Word travels fast in buildings like that. By evening, every staff member would know that Rose, the cook, had been fired for stealing. My reputation, built over decades of honest work, was destroyed in a single morning. I rode the subway back to Queens with tears I couldn't stop, surrounded by the city that no longer felt like home. My reflection in the train window showed a broken woman, gray hair disheveled, eyes red with crying, shoulders bent under the weight of false accusations. I looked like what Charles and Eleanor believed I was, a desperate thief who had finally been caught. But I knew the truth. I knew that I had never stolen anything in my life except maybe an extra hug from Emma when her parents weren't looking. I knew that every dollar I had ever earned was gained through honest work, through getting up before dawn and staying up past midnight, through pouring my heart into meals that nourished families. The problem was, knowing the truth and proving it are two very different things. My tiny studio apartment in Queens felt even smaller that night. The walls seemed to press in around me as I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the phone I couldn't afford to use for long-distance calls anymore. How could I tell Sarah about losing my job? How could I explain that her mother, who had raised her to be honest and hardworking, was being accused of theft? The financial pressure was crushing. Without the Morrison job, I had no income and less than $300 in my savings account. My rent was due in 2 weeks, and Sarah's next treatment payment was approaching like a storm I couldn't weather. For the first time in my adult life, I understood how people might be driven to desperate acts, not because they were criminals, but because the system had failed them so completely that survival became more important than dignity. But even facing homelessness and my daughter's medical crisis, I couldn't imagine taking something that didn't belong to me. My mother had raised me to believe that poverty was no excuse for dishonesty, that our integrity was the only wealth that truly belonged to us. "Hold your head high," she used to say, because an honest heart is worth more than all the riches in the world. I called Sarah that night and lied for the first time in years. I told her I was taking a break from working, that I wanted to spend more time focusing on my own health. She was too sick from chemotherapy to hear the strain in my voice, too focused on her own survival to question why her mother would suddenly stop working at 72 years old. The lie felt bitter in my mouth, but the truth would have hurt her more than the cancer already was. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my last morning at the Morrison penthouse. How had Eleanor's bracelet ended up in my apron pocket? Who had put it there? And why? The questions churned in my mind like ingredients that wouldn't blend, creating a mixture that tasted of confusion and betrayal. The next morning, I began looking for work. At 72, with no references from my most recent employer and a shadow of suspicion hanging over my reputation, the search felt hopeless. Restaurants wanted young, energetic cooks who could work double shifts and keep up with fast-paced kitchens. Private families wanted references and background checks that I couldn't provide. Even fast food places looked at my age and experience with skepticism. I was overqualified for some positions and too old for others. Days blended into weeks. I applied for food service jobs at hospitals, schools, and nursing homes. I offered to work as a catering assistant, a prep cook, even a dishwasher. But the job market in New York City is brutal for older workers, especially those without current references. Every rejection felt like another confirmation that maybe Charles and Eleanor were right. Maybe I was worthless, easily replaced, no longer needed. My savings dwindled quickly. First, the $300 disappeared into rent and utilities. Then I had to choose between groceries and Sarah's treatment payment, between keeping my phone service and buying my arthritis medication. The woman who had spent 15 years ensuring others never went hungry was now rationing rice and eggs to make them last through the week. I lost weight that spring, not from any intentional diet, but from the slow starvation that comes with poverty. My clothes hung loose on my frame, and I avoided mirrors because I didn't want to see what desperation looked like. But worse than the hunger was the isolation. Without work, without purpose, without the daily routine that had defined my life for 15 years, I felt invisible in a way that went beyond being ignored. I felt like I was disappearing entirely. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday in April, exactly 2 months after I had been fired. The landlord was apologetic but firm. 3 months of missed rent was more than he could absorb. I had 2 weeks to vacate the studio apartment that had been my sanctuary, my refuge from the cold marble halls of the Morrison penthouse. That night, I sat in my empty kitchen and wrote a letter I never intended to send. It was addressed to Charles Morrison, and it contained everything I had never been allowed to say during my 15 years of service. I wrote about the love I had poured into every meal, about the way Emma's face lit up when I made her special birthday cake, about the comfort I had tried to bring to a house that wealth had made cold. I wrote about the dignity of honest work, about the pride I had taken in feeding his family, and about the devastating impact of his accusations on a woman who had never stolen so much as a paperclip. But most of all, I wrote about forgiveness. Despite everything, despite the false accusations and the casual cruelty, despite being discarded like a broken appliance after 15 years of loyal service, I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because carrying the anger was too heavy for my tired heart. I sealed the letter and placed it in my recipe book next to my grandmother's handwritten instructions for apple pie and my mother's secret blend of spices for pot roast. It joined the other treasures of my life, not valuable in dollars or euros or Bitcoin, but priceless in the way they connected me to the women who had raised me and the traditions they had passed down. 3 days before I was to be evicted, something remarkable happened. A knock came at my door in the early evening, soft and hesitant. I expected the landlord, or perhaps a neighbor, offering condolences for my visible circumstances. Instead, I opened the door to find Maria Santos, the young housekeeper who had worked alongside me at the Morrison penthouse for the last 2 years of my employment. "Mrs. Rose," she said, her eyes bright with tears and excitement, "I have something important to tell you." Maria had always been kind to me, one of the few staff members who treated me as a person rather than a piece of furniture. She was from Guatemala, supporting family back home with her earnings, and she understood the weight of working for people who saw service workers as invisible. "Come in," I said, though my apartment offered little comfort. Just a folding chair and a bed. Most of my belongings already packed in boxes for a move I couldn't afford to make. Maria's news changed everything. She'd been cleaning Eleanor's bedroom the week after I was fired when she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in Eleanor's jewelry box, beneath layers of expensive bracelets and necklaces, was a small recording device, the kind used by private investigators or suspicious spouses. She was recording conversations, Maria explained, her voice shaking with anger. All of us. The security guards, the other housekeepers, you. She has hours of recordings of staff conversations, looking for reasons to fire people or reduce their pay. But that wasn't the worst of it. Maria had managed to listen to some of the recordings when Eleanor was out, and what she heard made her sick with rage. Eleanor and Patricia discussing their plan to frame me for theft, choosing the diamond bracelet because it was expensive enough to justify immediate termination, but not so valuable that they would involve police. "They planned it," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Patricia put the bracelet in your apron pocket while you were downstairs getting supplies from the storage room. They recorded themselves talking about how to make it look convincing, how to time the discovery, even how to act surprised when they found it. The revelation hit me like lightning. For months, I had tortured myself with questions about the bracelet, wondering if I was losing my memory, if I could have somehow taken it without realizing. The doubt had been eating at me like acid, making me question not just my actions, but my sanity. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would they do that?" Maria's explanation was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Eleanor had wanted to hire Marcus, the celebrity chef from the fundraiser, as their permanent chef. But Charles, despite his cruelty, had resisted the expense. Marcus charged 3 times my salary for part-time work. The theft accusation solved Eleanor's problem. It removed me without making Charles feel guilty about discarding a loyal employee, and it created the justification for hiring someone more expensive. My 15 years of service, my love for Emma and Michael, my dedication to creating warmth in their cold home, all of it had been sacrificed so Eleanor could have a celebrity chef who would impress her social circle. I was collateral damage in her quest for status, a pawn moved off the board to make room for a more prestigious piece. But Maria had brought me more than just the truth. She had brought me proof. Using her phone, she had managed to record portions of Eleanor's hidden tapes, capturing the conversations where Eleanor and Patricia planned my downfall. The audio quality was poor, recorded secretly and in segments, but their voices were clear enough to understand their intentions. "I can't keep working for them," Maria said, her voice firm despite her tears. "Not after knowing what they did to you. You were the only person in that house who treated me like family." That night, I listened to the recorded conversations that Maria had captured, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: righteous anger. Not the bitter rage of helplessness, but the clean, powerful fury that comes from knowing you were right all along. Eleanor's voice, cold and calculating, discussing how to plant the bracelet. Patricia's laughter as they planned my humiliation. The casual way they talked about destroying my life, like it was a business transaction with acceptable losses. But what shocked me most was Charles's voice on one of the recordings. Not participating in the plan, but not stopping it either. He knew. He knew his wife and daughter were framing me, and he allowed it to happen because it solved his problem as efficiently as a hostile takeover or a strategic bankruptcy. His ice blue eyes hadn't reflected uncertainty when he fired me. They had reflected guilt. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully that night. The truth was finally in my hands, and truth has a weight and power that money can't buy. I wasn't crazy, wasn't forgetful, wasn't a thief. I was exactly what I had always been, an honest woman who had been betrayed by people who mistook wealth for character. The next morning, I made a decision that 15 years of service had prepared me for. I was going to confront Charles Morrison, not as his former employee begging for mercy, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity. I was going to look into those ice blue eyes and serve him a truth he couldn't buy his way out of. But first, I needed to prepare. Just like cooking a complex meal, confrontation requires the right ingredients, proper timing, and confidence in the recipe. I had truth, I had proof, and I had something more valuable than all of Charles Morrison's investments combined. I had nothing left to lose. Have you ever reached that moment where fear becomes freedom? Where having lost everything means you finally have the courage to stand up for yourself? That morning, standing in my nearly empty apartment with Maria's recording in my hands, I felt stronger than I had in years. Not because I had power, but because I had purpose. I spent that day preparing like I was planning the most important meal of my life. I listened to the recordings again, taking notes, understanding the timeline of their deception. I researched employment law, learning about wrongful termination and defamation. I practiced what I would say, how I would stand, how I would look Charles Morrison in the eyes when I served him the truth he had tried so hard to avoid. Most importantly, I called Sarah and told her everything. She was weak from her latest round of chemotherapy, but her voice burned with fury when I explained what had happened. "Mom," she said, "you've spent your whole life taking care of other people. It's time someone took care of you." She insisted on flying to New York despite her illness, bringing her husband Tom and their teenage son Jake, my grandson, who barely knew me but was ready to fight for family. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. I had people who believed in me, who knew my character, who understood that the woman who had raised a daughter with integrity would never become a thief at 72. The plan was simple. Maria still had access to the penthouse. And she had arranged for me to be in the building the next morning during Charles's breakfast time. She would ensure that Eleanor and Patricia were both present, so all the conspirators would face the truth together. I would play the recordings, present my evidence, and demand not just an apology but public vindication of my character. But as I prepared for this confrontation, I realized something surprising about myself. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking closure. I didn't want to humiliate Charles Morrison the way he had humiliated me, even though I now had the power to do exactly that. I wanted him to understand the real cost of his betrayal, not just to me, but to himself. Money had taught him to see people as assets and liabilities, investments to be managed or discarded based on their value to his portfolio. But in allowing his family to destroy an innocent woman, he had lost something that no amount of Bitcoin or real estate could restore: his integrity. He had become the kind of man who would let lies stand because they were convenient, who would sacrifice loyalty for status, who would choose comfort over conscience. That night, I cooked for myself for the first time in weeks. Nothing elaborate, just a simple pasta with the vegetables Maria had brought me, seasoned with herbs I had grown on my windowsill during better days. As I stirred the sauce, I felt like myself again. Not Rose, the dismissed employee, not Rose, the accused thief, but Rose, the cook, the nurturer, the woman who knew that love and truth were the most important ingredients in any recipe. I set my small table with the few dishes I hadn't packed, lit a candle I had been saving, and ate my meal slowly, savoring each bite. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, vindication, and the end of a chapter that had nearly destroyed me. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had rediscovered her worth, preparing to stand up for herself with the same quiet strength that had carried her through decades of service. The morning came gray and cold, typical for New York in late April. I dressed carefully, not in the uniform of service I had worn for 15 years, but in my best dress, the navy blue one with small flowers that Sarah had given me for my 70th birthday. I wanted to look like what I was, a dignified woman seeking justice, not a former employee begging for scraps. Maria met me a block from the Morrison building, her face pale with nervousness, but her resolve firm. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Rose?" I thought about that question. Was I ready to face the people who had betrayed me? Ready to challenge a man whose wealth could crush me like an insect? Ready to demand respect from those who had treated me as disposable? "I've been ready for 72 years, I said. I just didn't know it until now. The lobby of the Morrison building felt different this time. I wasn't sneaking through back entrances or riding service elevators. I walked through the main doors with my head high, my evidence in my purse, and my grandson, Jake, beside me for support. The doorman, who had ignored me during my dismissal, now nodded respectfully, perhaps sensing that something had changed in the dynamic he thought he understood. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt eternal. Each floor that passed brought back memories. 15 years of early mornings, of carrying groceries and preparing meals, of cleaning up after parties I wasn't invited to attend. But instead of sadness, I felt a strange peace. I was returning not as a supplicant, but as an equal. For the first time in 15 years, I was entering the Morrison penthouse as myself. Maria used her key to let us in, and the familiar sounds and smells hit me like a wave. The kitchen where I had spent so many hours was unchanged, still cold and sterile despite the expensive equipment, still lacking the warmth that comes from cooking with love rather than obligation. I could hear Charles and Eleanor talking in the dining room, their voices carrying the casual arrogance of people who believed they were untouchable. But they were about to learn something that money can't buy. The truth has its own power, and dignity can't be stolen, only surrendered. I walked into that marble dining room where I had served thousands of meals, where I had watched Emma and Michael grow up, where I had been invisible for so long that they had forgotten I was human enough to be hurt by their betrayal. Charles was reading financial reports on his tablet, probably checking the overnight performance of his cryptocurrency investments. Eleanor was scrolling through her phone, planning some social event that would showcase their wealth to people who cared only about their own status. When they looked up and saw me, the shock on their faces was immediate and complete. Charles actually dropped his tablet and Eleanor's phone clattered onto the marble table. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with the automatic authority of someone accustomed to controlling her environment. "I came to give you something," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Something you've been missing for months without even knowing it." Charles had recovered from his initial surprise and was reaching for his phone, probably to call security. But I held up my hand, and something in my posture made him pause. "You can call security in a few minutes," I said. "But first you need to hear this." I placed Maria's phone on the table and pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "The bracelet needs to be expensive enough to justify firing her immediately, but not so valuable that Charles will want to involve the police." The color drained from Eleanor's face as her own words condemned her. Patricia, who had just entered the dining room with her morning coffee, stopped as if she'd walked into a wall. And Charles? Charles looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. I let the recording play for several minutes, their conspiracy unfolding in their own voices, the casual cruelty in their planning, the laughter as they discussed planting evidence, the cold calculation of destroying an innocent woman's life for their convenience, all of it captured and played back in the room where they had executed their plan. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. These people who had controlled every aspect of their environment, who had bought and sold companies with the same ease others bought groceries, suddenly found themselves powerless against the simple truth. Charles spoke first, his voice hoarse. "Rose, No," I said, cutting him off. "For 15 years, you talked and I listened. This time, I talk and you listen." I looked into those ice-blue eyes that had shown me no mercy, no doubt, no recognition of my humanity. But now they were different. Now they held something I had never seen there before: shame. "I came to this house when I was 57 years old," I began, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I had just lost my husband and I needed work to survive. You hired me not because you saw my talent or experience, but because I was desperate enough to work for less than I was worth." Eleanor started to speak, but I continued without pause. "For 15 years, I made your house a home. I cooked with love when you had forgotten what love tastes like. I cared for your grandchildren when you were too busy managing your investments to pay attention to their hearts. I was loyal when loyalty was old-fashioned, honest when honesty was inconvenient, and faithful when faithfulness was taken for granted." Charles's hands were shaking slightly. The man who commanded millions in business deals was trembling before a 72-year-old woman speaking truth. "And when it became convenient to get rid of me," I continued, "you didn't just fire me. You destroyed my reputation. You branded me a thief. You made sure I could never work again, never hold my head high again, never trust my own memory again. You didn't just take my job. You tried to take my dignity." Patricia had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she faced the human cost of what they had done. But Eleanor remained defiant, her jaw set in stubborn refusal to admit wrongdoing. "You can't prove any of this in court," Eleanor said. "Those recordings were made illegally, without consent." I smiled then, a sad smile that held decades of patience with small, cruel people. "I'm not going to court, Eleanor. I'm not seeking money or revenge. I'm here for something much simpler and much more valuable." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them like dust on expensive furniture. "I'm here to look each of you in the eye and tell you exactly what you are." I turned to Charles first. "You're a man who built an empire on ruthless calculation. But you calculated wrong this time. You thought my loyalty was weakness, my dedication was desperation, and my love was worthless. You accumulated wealth in stocks and real estate and cryptocurrency, but you lost the one investment that matters, your character. No portfolio in the world can restore what you've bankrupted in yourself. Charles's eyes filled with tears, actual tears from a man who hadn't cried in decades. "And you, Patricia," I said, turning to the daughter who had planted evidence in my apron like a corrupt detective. "You inherited your father's business sense, but none of his original integrity. You're so focused on managing the family's assets that you forgot the most valuable asset any family has, the ability to trust each other. How will you ever trust anyone, knowing what you're capable of? How will anyone ever trust you?" Patricia's sobbing grew louder, but I wasn't finished. "And Eleanor," I said, facing the woman who had treated me like an inconvenient expense for 15 years. "You have everything money can buy, but you've never learned the difference between cost and value. You traded a woman who loved your grandchildren for a chef who makes pretty plates. You exchanged loyalty for status, truth for convenience, and warmth for recognition. Your house will never be a home because you don't understand what makes a home." The room fell silent except for Patricia's quiet crying. These people who had controlled every aspect of their lives suddenly understood that they had lost control of the most important thing, who they were as human beings. Charles stood up slowly, like a man who had aged years in minutes. "Rose," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what can I do? How can I make this right?" I had prepared for anger, for denial, for attempts to discredit me or minimize their actions, but I hadn't prepared for genuine remorse from a man who had seemed incapable of human emotion beyond greed and calculation. "You can't make it right," I said simply. "Some things, once broken, can't be fixed, but you can stop making it worse." I reached into my purse and pulled out a letter, not the one I had written months ago in my apartment, but a new one I had composed the night before. "This is what you can do. You can read this letter at your next board meeting, to your investors, to your social circle. You can tell the truth about what happened here, publicly and without lawyers softening the edges. You can restore my reputation the same way you destroyed it, completely and without reservation." Charles took the letter with trembling hands. "And if I do this, will you forgive me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Forgiveness. They wanted forgiveness from the woman they had tried to destroy, as if my absolution could wash away their sins and restore their comfortable world view. "Forgiveness isn't something you can buy or earn or demand," I said. "It's something I give or don't give, for my own peace, not for your comfort. Whether you deserve it isn't the question. The question is whether I deserve to carry your guilt along with my own struggles." I looked at each of them. Charles with his tear-stained face, Patricia with her shoulders shaking from sobs, Eleanor with her stubborn pride cracking like old paint. "I forgive you because forgiveness is freedom from anger, and I've been angry long enough. I forgive you because I choose peace over justice, mercy over revenge. I forgive you because that's who I am, not because of who you are." But then I stepped closer to Charles, close enough to see my reflection in his ice-blue eyes, and my voice became steel wrapped in velvet. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I trust you. It doesn't mean I'll work for you again. It doesn't mean we're friends or that what you did was acceptable. Forgiveness means I'm releasing you from my heart so I can fill that space with better things." Charles nodded, understanding perhaps for the first time in his life that some transactions can't be completed with money, some debts can't be bought out of, and some mistakes cost more than any portfolio can cover. "There's one more thing," I said, turning toward the kitchen where I had spent so many years creating love disguised as food. "Emma and Michael, your grandchildren, They loved me, and I loved them. They don't understand why Grandma Rose suddenly disappeared from their lives. They don't need to know about your crimes, but they deserve better than lies. Eleanor spoke for the first time since hearing the recordings. What do you want us to tell them? Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them that adults sometimes make mistakes that hurt people they care about. Tell them that Grandma Rose still loves them, but sometimes love means saying goodbye to protect the people you love from more hurt. And tell them that when they grow up, they should choose to be the kind of people who protect the innocent instead of betraying them. Charles walked over to the kitchen window, the one that looked out over Central Park, the view that had cost him millions. I've been standing at this window every morning since you left, he said quietly. The house feels different without you, empty, cold. The food has no soul. Food is like trust, I replied. Once you've poisoned it, you can't make it nourish anyone anymore. I moved toward the elevator, my purpose complete, my dignity restored. But Charles called out one more time. Rose, wait, please. Can I at least write you a recommendation? Help you find new employment? Your financial situation? I turned back one final time. Charles, for 15 years you paid me a salary, but you never paid me what I was worth. The recommendation I need doesn't come from you. It comes from every person who tasted my cooking and felt loved. The employment I need doesn't come from serving people who see me as disposable. It comes from finding people who understand that experience and heart are worth more than youth and desperation. But the money, he pressed, your rent, your daughter's medical bills, I know you're struggling. Yes, I said simply, I'm struggling. But I'm struggling honestly with my integrity intact and my conscience clear. You have millions in assets and investments, but you're bankrupt in the only currency that matters. I'd rather struggle with honor than prosper through betrayal. The elevator doors closed on that chapter of my life, carrying me away from 15 years of invisible service and towards something I couldn't yet see but could finally feel, hope. Jake was waiting in the lobby, concern written across his young face. How did it go, Grandma? It went exactly as it needed to, I said, putting my arm around my grandson who barely knew me but had still come to support me. Now it's time for the rest of the story. Within a week, Charles had kept his word. He read my letter at a Morrison Holdings board meeting, admitting publicly that a loyal employee had been wrongfully terminated due to false accusations. The story was picked up by several business publications, not because the firing of a cook was newsworthy, but because a prominent businessman admitting to framing an employee was unprecedented. The publicity brought unexpected opportunities. A reporter from the New York Times wanted to interview me about age discrimination in domestic service. A documentary filmmaker was interested in my story as part of a larger project about invisible workers in wealthy households. Most surprisingly, 3 different restaurants reached out offering employment, not because they pitied me, but because they had heard Charles's public admission that my cooking had soul that couldn't be replaced. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Emma called me. She was now 10 years old enough to understand more than her grandparents had given her credit for. She had overheard adult conversations, pieced together fragments, and finally asked her parents directly why Grandma Rose had disappeared. When they told her a simplified version of the truth, that grown-ups had made a mistake that hurt someone they cared about, she had asked for my phone number. Grandma Rose, she said, her voice small but determined, I don't care what happened with the grown-ups. I miss your cookies. I miss the way you made mac and cheese with the crispy cheese on top. I miss the stories you told while we cooked together. Talking to Emma broke something open in my chest that had been closed since that terrible morning in March. I realized that while the adults in her life had used me as a pawn in their games of status and convenience, the children had simply loved me for who I was. Their love was honest, uncomplicated, and worth more than all the Morrison family's investments combined. I miss you too, sweetheart, I said, tears streaming down my face. "And someday, when you're older, I'll teach you how to make those cookies yourself, so you can make them for people you love." "Will you write down the recipe?" she asked, "in case I forget?" "I'll do better than that," I promised. "I'll write down all the recipes, along with the stories that go with them. Because recipes without stories are just lists of ingredients. The stories are what make them magic." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. I began writing down not just recipes, but the memories connected to each dish. My grandmother's apple pie that made our farm kitchen smell like heaven, my mother's pot roast that could cure any heartbreak, the chocolate chip cookies that had been my children's favorite after-school snack, the Sunday gravy that had brought 3 generations together around one table. Each recipe became a story, and each story revealed something about the women who had cooked before me, the families who had been nourished by their hands, and the love that passed from generation to generation through shared meals. I wasn't just documenting cooking techniques, I was preserving a legacy. Sarah's health improved as her treatments progressed, and she became my strongest supporter in what started as a personal project, but grew into something larger. "Mom," she said during one of her visits to New York, "this isn't just a cookbook, this is history. It's the story of women who fed their families through depression and war, who created abundance from scarcity, who built communities one meal at a time." She was right. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my story was connected to thousands of other stories. Women who had been invisible in their own lives, but had shaped the world through their nurturing, their sacrifice, and their quiet strength. We were the ones who remembered birthdays and favorite foods, who stayed up all night with sick children, who stretched budgets and made meals from whatever was available. We were the backbone of families, the keepers of traditions, the ones who created home. With Sarah's help, I compiled my recipes and stories into a manuscript I called Invisible Hands, Recipes and Remembrances from Kitchen Women. It was part memoir, part cookbook, part history of the domestic workers, grandmothers, and caregivers who had nourished others while remaining largely unrecognized. Finding a publisher seemed impossible at first. Literary agents were polite but dismissive. Another cookbook by an unknown author didn't fit their market strategies. But Sarah, with her background in marketing and her determination to see her mother's story told, suggested a different approach. We started a food blog called Grandma Rose's Kitchen, where I shared one recipe with its story each week. The blog began modestly, with Emma and Michael as my first followers, but gradually grew as people discovered that the recipes worked not just practically, but emotionally. Readers began sharing their own stories in the comments, connecting their family foods to their own memories and losses. The blog's breakthrough came when a food writer for Bon Appetit discovered my post about depression cake, a chocolate cake made without eggs, butter, or milk that my grandmother had invented during the 1930s, when ingredients were scarce, but birthdays still needed celebrating. The writer contacted me for an interview about Depression-era cooking, and the resulting article brought thousands of new readers to my tiny corner of the internet. Suddenly, publishers who had previously ignored my manuscript were calling Sarah, interested in turning Invisible Hands into a book. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same industry that had dismissed me as unmarketable now wanted my story because someone else had validated its worth. But I wasn't bitter about the delayed recognition. I had learned the difference between gratitude and desperation, between opportunity and obligation. I chose Hearth and Home Publishers, a small company that specialized in books about food and family, because their editor understood what I was trying to accomplish. "This isn't just a cookbook," she said during our first meeting. "It's a reclamation project. You're reclaiming the value of women's work, the importance of food traditions, and the dignity of service that goes unrecognized." The book was published on a spring morning exactly 1 year after my confrontation with the Morrison family. I held the first copy in my hands, my name on the cover, my words and recipes inside, and felt something I had never experienced before, the pride of being truly seen. The launch event was held at a small bookstore in Harlem, not far from the community where I had eventually found an apartment I could afford. I expected maybe 20 people, Sarah and her family, a few neighbors, perhaps some readers of the blog. Instead, nearly 100 people showed up, including several prominent food writers, cookbook authors, and restaurant owners who had been following my story. But the moment that brought me to tears was when Maria walked through the door, followed by 2 other women I recognized from the wealthy households where they worked. They had taken time off, risked disapproval from their employers, to celebrate a fellow domestic worker whose voice had finally been heard. "Mrs. Rose," Maria said, embracing me with tears in her eyes, "you did it. You made us visible." The book's success was modest by bestseller standards, but enormous by the standards of my previous existence. It sold steadily, won a regional award for memoir writing, and most importantly sparked conversations about the value we place on domestic work, elder care, and the traditionally feminine labor of nurturing. But perhaps the most meaningful response came in the letters I received from readers. Women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who had spent lifetimes cooking for others without recognition, daughters who finally understood their mother's sacrifices, granddaughters who asked for family recipes before it was too late to learn them. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a young woman named Jennifer whose grandmother had been a domestic worker in wealthy households for 40 years. "Reading your book helped me understand my grandmother's life," she wrote. "She died without anyone outside our family knowing how talented she was, how much love she poured into every meal she made for other people's families. Thank you for honoring women like her." That letter reminded me that my story was bigger than my personal vindication. It was about dignifying work that society minimizes, recognizing love that goes unacknowledged, and preserving wisdom that too often dies with the women who carry it. Charles Morrison, to his credit, had continued to honor his commitment to publicly acknowledging his family's wrongdoing. When Invisible Hands was published, he purchased 50 copies to distribute to his business associates, with a note explaining that the author was a former employee whose reputation he had unjustly damaged. It was a small gesture that cost him little, but it meant everything to me because it completed the circle of accountability. Eleanor and Patricia never reached out directly, but I heard through Maria that Eleanor had quietly donated a substantial amount to a scholarship fund for older women returning to work. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement that actions have consequences beyond their immediate victims. 8 months after the book launch, I received an invitation that took my breath away. The James Beard Foundation, the most prestigious organization in American culinary culture, wanted to honor me with their Good Food for Good award, recognizing individuals who use food to create positive change in their communities. Standing on that stage in Chicago, looking out at an audience of celebrated chefs and food writers, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. From invisible cook to accused thief to published author, all because I had finally found the courage to tell my truth and stand in my dignity. I accepted the award not just for myself, but for all the invisible hands that feed the world, the grandmothers who pass down recipes, the domestic workers who nourish other people's families, the women who create abundance from scarcity and turn simple ingredients into expressions of love. In my acceptance speech, I said, "Food is never just about feeding the body. It's about feeding the soul, preserving culture, and creating connection. The women who do this work, in their own kitchens and other people's kitchens, are not just cooks. They are keepers of tradition, creators of comfort, and architects of love. When we honor food, we must honor the hands that prepare it with such care." The standing ovation that followed wasn't for me alone. It was for every woman who had ever stood at a stove, poured love into a pot, and served others without expecting recognition in return. Today, I live in a small apartment in Harlem with a kitchen that smells like cinnamon and possibility. I teach cooking classes twice a week at a community center, sharing not just techniques but stories, helping younger women understand that their grandmother's recipes are treasures worth preserving. I've started working on my second book, this one focused on holiday traditions and the way food creates family identity. Emma, now 13 and taller than I am, visits me every few months. We cook together in my tiny kitchen, and I teach her the recipes she loved as a child but now approaches with the seriousness of someone who understands that these skills are gifts. Michael, at 11, is more interested in baseball than cooking, but he still asks for my cookies whenever he comes by, and I treasure the way his face lights up at that first bite. The Morrison family has hired a new chef, someone with impressive credentials and a salary that reflects their celebrity status. But Maria tells me that the house still feels cold, that the meals are pretty but empty, that Charles often stands by the kitchen window looking out at Central Park with something like regret in his eyes. I don't take satisfaction in their continued emptiness, but I understand it. When you break trust, it takes years to rebuild. When you choose status over substance, you often get exactly what you paid for, something impressive but hollow. Charles Morrison can afford the most expensive ingredients, the most talented chefs, the most elaborate presentations, but he can't buy back the warmth that comes from being cooked for by someone who truly cares about your well-being. Sometimes, late at night in my comfortable solitude, I think about forgiveness and justice, about the difference between getting what you deserve and getting what you need. I needed to reclaim my dignity, to tell my truth, to stand in my worth. Charles and his family deserved consequences for their cruelty, and they received them, not through legal punishment, but through the loss of something they didn't realize they valued until it was gone. But more than revenge or justice, I found something better: purpose. My story became a bridge for other women's stories. My voice created space for other invisible women to speak their truths. My recipes became a way to preserve not just flavors, but the love that created them. Last week, I received a letter from a woman in Seattle whose mother had been a domestic worker for 60 years. Your book inspired me to interview my mother about her recipes and experiences before it's too late, she wrote. I'm putting together a family cookbook with her stories. Thank you for showing me that these stories matter. That letter reminded me that the most important ingredient in any recipe isn't listed in the ingredients list. It's the love and intention the cook brings to the mixing bowl. Money can buy the finest ingredients, the most sophisticated equipment, the most acclaimed chefs. But it can't buy the ingredient that makes food nourishing instead of just filling. The genuine care of someone who wants to see you well-fed and happy. I spent 15 years being invisible in a house that valued everything except the human heart. I was accused, dismissed, and discarded like an old appliance that had outlived its usefulness. But in the end, that experience taught me something valuable about resilience, dignity, and the power of truth to set us free from the prisons other people try to build around us. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever poured love into work that went unrecognized, made sacrifices that went unacknowledged, or stood strong in situations where others tried to make you feel small? Your story matters. Your invisible hands have created more value than you know. Your quiet strength has held up more of the world than anyone realizes. The lessons I learned in that cold penthouse kitchen weren't just about cooking or even about standing up for myself. They were about the fundamental human need to be seen, to be valued, to have our contributions recognized and our dignity respected. In a world that too often measures worth by wealth and success by status, it's easy to forget that the most important work, the work of nurturing, caring, and creating comfort, is often done by people who never receive awards or recognition. My cooking classes in Harlem have become something more than instruction sessions. They've become healing circles where women share their stories, along with their recipes. Last Tuesday, a woman named Dorothy, 81 years old, brought a recipe for sweet potato pie that had been in her family for 4 generations. As she taught us how to get the custard just right, she also told us about her grandmother who was born into slavery, but who could make a feast from scraps, who used food to keep her family's spirit alive during the darkest times. Cooking, Dorothy said, her hand still steady as she rolled out pie dough, was how we survived, not just the food itself, but the love we stirred into every pot. When you were hungry, you knew someone cared enough to feed you. When you were celebrating, you knew someone would make it special with something sweet. When you were grieving, you knew someone would bring comfort in a covered dish. Another woman, Linda, shared the story of her mother who had worked as a cook for 3 different families over 25 years, never receiving more than basic wages, but somehow managing to send all 5 of her children to college. She used to say that feeding people was sacred work, Linda remembered. She said if you cook with meanness in your heart, it shows up in the food. But if you cook with love, people can taste it. These stories remind me that my experience with the Morrison family, while painful and unique in its cruelty, was part of a larger pattern of how society treats the women who nourish us. We are the ones who get up early to pack school lunches, who stay up late preparing for family gatherings, who stretch budgets to make sure everyone gets fed, who remember dietary restrictions and favorite desserts and what comfort food means to each person in our care. Yet we are also the ones whose labor is taken for granted, whose expertise is dismissed as just cooking, whose years of experience are valued less than formal credentials, whose age becomes a liability instead of an asset. We are expected to be grateful for any recognition while doing work that literally keeps the world functioning. 6 months ago, I was contacted by a congressional aide who had read my book. Representative Maria Gonzalez was preparing legislation to strengthen protections for domestic workers, and she wanted my input on the specific challenges faced by older women in household service. I found myself in Washington, D.C., testifying before a House subcommittee about age discrimination, wrongful termination, and the lack of legal recourse available to domestic workers who are mistreated by their employers. Sitting in that formal hearing room, speaking into a microphone while congresspeople listened and took notes, I thought about how far I had traveled from that morning in the Morrison penthouse when I was escorted out like a criminal. The woman who had been voiceless for so long was now helping to shape policy that could protect other women from similar treatment. But even in that moment of recognition and influence, I remembered where my strength came from. Not from the book sales or the awards or the media attention, but from the simple act of standing up for truth, of refusing to accept shame for something I hadn't done, of believing that my dignity was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. The subcommittee hearing led to other opportunities to speak out about the issues facing older workers and domestic employees. I was invited to conferences, universities, and community organizations to share my story and advocate for policy changes. Each time I spoke, women came up to me afterward with similar experiences, not all as dramatic as mine, but all sharing the common thread of being undervalued, underpaid, and too often dismissed when they were no longer convenient. There was Margaret, who had been a nanny for wealthy families for 30 years before being fired when she developed arthritis and couldn't keep up with toddlers. There was Carmen, who had been accused of stealing when jewelry went missing, only to have it turn up later in the employer's own jewelry box. But by then, Carmen had already lost her job and her reputation. There was Susan, who'd been caring for an elderly woman for 8 years before the woman's children decided she was too expensive and replaced her with someone younger and cheaper. Each woman's story added weight to my understanding that individual cruelty is often just the visible tip of systemic problems. The Morrison family didn't frame me for theft because they were uniquely evil people. They did it because they lived in a system that made it easy to dispose of inconvenient employees and difficult for those employees to fight back. They knew I had little recourse, few resources, and no power to challenge their version of events. but they hadn't counted on Maria's conscience or my eventual decision to fight back after I had nothing left to lose. They certainly hadn't anticipated that their actions would eventually be exposed in a book that would spark conversations about worker dignity and domestic labor rights. The ripple effects continued. Sarah, whose health had stabilized, decided to leave her corporate marketing job and start a nonprofit organization focused on protecting older domestic workers. She called it Dignity in Service and began with a simple mission: providing legal assistance, job placement services, and advocacy for household employees over 50 who face discrimination or mistreatment. "Mom," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls, "your story showed me that the work you did, the work women like you do, is what holds families together. But the women who do this work have no one protecting them. You got justice because you had truth on your side and nothing left to lose. But what about all the women who can't fight back, who need their jobs too much to risk confrontation, who don't have daughters with marketing backgrounds to help them tell their stories?" Sarah's nonprofit started small, with just her working part-time from a borrowed office space. But the need was enormous. Within 6 months, she had received over 200 calls from domestic workers facing various forms of discrimination, wage theft, wrongful termination, and worse. She began building a network of volunteer lawyers, connecting with existing labor organizations, and developing resources to help vulnerable workers understand their rights and options. The success of Dignity in Service led to something I had never expected: the Morrison family reaching out directly. Not Charles or Eleanor, but their son James, Emma and Michael's father, who had been largely absent from the story but had been watching its development from a distance. James called me on a Wednesday evening in November, almost 2 years after the confrontation in the penthouse. His voice was hesitant, nervous, and much more humble than I had ever heard from any member of his family. "Mrs. Rose," he began, "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I wondered if we could meet. There are things I need to say and questions I need to ask." I agreed to meet him at a small cafe in Manhattan, curious about what had motivated this conversation after so much time. James arrived early, looking older than his 42 years, his expensive suit somehow making him appear smaller rather than more impressive. "First," he said before I had even sat down, "I want to apologize, not just for what my family did to you, but for what I didn't do. I knew something was wrong when you were fired. I knew my mother had been pushing for a celebrity chef, and I knew you would never steal anything. But I didn't speak up because it was easier to let someone else handle the household staff issues." He paused, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "I let my father fire you, let my mother and sister destroy your reputation, because challenging them seemed harder than just letting it happen. I was a coward." James went on to explain that reading my book had forced him to confront his own complicity in his family's cruelty. More importantly, it had made him look at how he was raising his own children, Emma and Michael, who still asked about Grandma Rose and couldn't understand why the adults in their lives had become so evasive about my disappearance. "Emma found your book in a bookstore," James continued. "She recognized your photo on the back cover and bought it with her allowance money. She read the whole thing in one night, and the next morning she came to me with tears in her eyes and asked how we could have hurt someone who loved us." I felt my throat tighten at the thought of Emma, now a teenager, reading about the betrayal her family had inflicted on someone she had loved and trusted. "She wants to see you," James said quietly. "Both kids do. But I know that might be painful for you, and I know we've lost the right to ask for anything. I needed you to know that not all of us are proud of what happened. Some of us are trying to do better." The meeting with James led to something I hadn't dared to hope for: a reunion with Emma and Michael. We met at a park in Central Park, not far from the penthouse where I had spent so many years. Emma, now 14 and beautiful in the way young girls are when they're just beginning to understand their own power, ran to me with tears in her eyes. "Grandma Rose," she said, using the name she hadn't spoken in years. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what they did to you, and I'm sorry I wasn't old enough to stop it." Michael, 12 now and approaching the awkwardness of adolescence, was more reserved, but no less genuine. "I never believed you stole anything," he said quietly. "Your cookies were too good to come from someone with stealing in their heart." We spent that afternoon cooking together in my Harlem kitchen, Emma carefully taking notes as I taught her the apple turnover recipe she had loved as a child, Michael more interested in eating than cooking, but happy to be the official taste tester for our efforts. For a few hours, we recaptured some of the warmth and joy that had been lost in the adults' betrayals and accusations. But I was also careful to be honest with them about what their family had done and why I couldn't simply return to my old role in their lives. They were old enough now to understand that actions have consequences, that trust once broken requires time and intention to rebuild, and that love doesn't automatically erase the pain of betrayal. "I will always love you both," I told them as we shared the apple turnovers we had made together. "But love isn't the same as trust, and trust isn't the same as going back to the way things were. What happened changed all of us, and we have to figure out what our relationship looks like now." Emma, wise beyond her years, nodded solemnly. "I understand, but can we still learn cooking from you? Can we still be part of your life, even if it's different now?" "Absolutely," I said, feeling a warmth in my chest that I had thought was gone forever. Cooking together, sharing recipes, creating new memories, that's the best way to honor what we had while building something new. Over the following months, Emma and Michael became regular visitors to my cooking classes and occasional guests at my small kitchen table. Emma, in particular, showed real talent and interest in cooking, approaching each recipe with the seriousness of someone who understood she was learning more than just culinary techniques. James, to his credit, supported their relationship with me and even began making changes in his own life that reflected a new understanding of responsibility and accountability. He left his position at his father's company and started his own business focused on ethical real estate development, projects that included affordable housing and community spaces rather than just luxury properties for wealthy investors. Charles and Eleanor, meanwhile, remained largely unchanged. Charles continued to manage his vast investments and cryptocurrency portfolio, while Eleanor maintained her social calendar and philanthropic activities. They had fulfilled their obligation to publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing, but they showed no interest in deeper reflection or genuine repair of the relationships they had damaged. However, Maria brought me occasional updates about their household, and these glimpses into their current life confirmed what I had expected. They had gained wealth and status, but lost something much more valuable in the process. The celebrity chef Marcus lasted only 8 months before quitting in frustration over Eleanor's impossible demands and constant criticism. His replacement was a competent but emotionally distant professional who prepared technically perfect meals that no one particularly enjoyed. The penthouse kitchen, once filled with the warmth of my early morning preparations and the joy of Emma and Michael's visits, had become purely functional, a place where expensive ingredients were transformed into impressive but soulless presentations. More tellingly, Charles's health had declined noticeably. The stress of maintaining his empire, combined with the guilt he carried over what had happened to me, had manifested in high blood pressure, insomnia, and a general sense of dissatisfaction that no amount of financial success could cure. When he stood by the kitchen window looking out at Central Park, Maria told me, he looked like a man watching life pass by from behind glass. Eleanor, for her part, had become even more isolated in her social circle. The public acknowledgement of what they had done to me had damaged her reputation among other wealthy wives, not because they were particularly moral, but because being publicly exposed for such behavior was considered poor form in their social stratum. She spent more time alone in the penthouse, maintaining her routines but finding less pleasure in them. The irony was complete. In trying to upgrade their lifestyle by replacing me with someone more prestigious, they had downgraded their actual quality of life. They had chosen image over substance and discovered that image without substance leaves you hungry no matter how expensive your meals. But my focus was no longer on their consequences or their regrets. I had found my purpose in helping other women find their voices, preserve their stories, and claim their dignity. The success of Invisible Hands had led to a contract for my second book, and I was deep into the research and writing process. This new book, tentatively titled Feast Days: How Food Creates Family, explored the way holiday traditions and celebratory meals build identity across generations. I interviewed dozens of women about their families' food traditions, the recipes passed down through immigration, war, and social change, the adaptations made when ingredients weren't available or budgets were tight, the innovations that became new traditions. Each interview revealed the same truth I had discovered in my own life. Food is never just about nutrition. It's about memory, identity, love, and the human need to create meaning through shared experiences. The woman who makes her grandmother's tamales every Christmas is preserving more than a recipe. She's maintaining a connection to family history, cultural identity, and the wisdom of women who came before her. The research for this book took me to communities across the country, from the Italian-American families in Boston who still make their own pasta for Sunday dinners, to the African-American churches in Mississippi where women arrive hours early to prepare meals that will feed hundreds after service. I interviewed recent immigrants who were adapting their traditional recipes to American ingredients, elderly women who were the last keepers of family food secrets, and young mothers who were trying to balance convenience with tradition in their busy lives. Everywhere I went, I found the same themes: love expressed through food, tradition maintained against the pressures of modern life, and women who understood that their kitchens were the heart of something much larger than daily sustenance. But I also found the same challenges: work that went unrecognized, expertise that was taken for granted, and contributions that were valued less than they deserved to be. The grandmother who spent 3 days making pierogi for the church festival, but whose recipe was never written down. The woman who single-handedly managed Thanksgiving dinner for 20 relatives, but was expected to clean up afterward while others watched football. The immigrant mother who taught her daughters to cook her homeland's food, but worried that the recipes would die with her generation. These stories reinforced my conviction that preserving food traditions is essential cultural work that deserves recognition and support. We talk about the importance of maintaining our heritage, but we often ignore the women who do the daily work of keeping those traditions alive through their cooking, their teaching, and their insistence that certain recipes and rituals matter. My second book was scheduled for publication in the spring, and I was already planning the cookbook classes and speaking engagements that would accompany its release. But more than the professional success, I was excited about the conversations it might spark and the women it might inspire to share their own stories. Sarah's nonprofit, Dignity and Service, had grown beyond either of our expectations. What started as a small organization helping individual domestic workers had evolved into an advocacy group working on policy change, public education, and legal reform. Sarah had been invited to testify before Congress about the need for stronger labor protections, and several states were considering legislation based on the model bill her organization had developed. The work was demanding and sometimes frustrating, but Sarah found it deeply meaningful. Every time we help one woman get justice or change one law that protects vulnerable workers, I think about you and all those years you spent taking care of other people, she told me during one of our conversations. This is my way of taking care of the women who take care of everyone else. I was proud of the work Sarah was doing, but I was even more proud of the woman she had become. Her experience with cancer had taught her about vulnerability and strength, while watching my struggle had shown her the importance of standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. She had taken the lessons from both experiences and channeled them into work that was making a real difference in other people's lives. Jake, my grandson who had supported me during the confrontation with the Morrison family, was now in college studying social work. He often said that witnessing my fight for justice had inspired him to pursue a career helping others navigate systems that weren't designed to protect them. He spent summers working with Sarah's organization, learning about labor law and advocacy, while providing support to domestic workers facing various forms of exploitation. Emma and Michael remained regular presences in my life, though our relationship had evolved as they grew older and developed their own interests and friendships. Emma, now a skilled home cook in her own right, had started a food blog where she shared recipes and stories about family traditions and intergenerational cooking. Several of her posts featured recipes she had learned from me, along with reflections on the importance of preserving culinary knowledge and respecting the women who keep food traditions alive. Michael, though less interested in cooking, had become passionate about social justice issues and often asked thoughtful questions about worker rights, economic inequality, and the responsibility that wealthy families have toward the people who work for them. Both children were growing into young adults who understood that privilege comes with obligations and that treating others with dignity isn't optional. Their father, James, continued to support their relationship with me, and over time, he and I had developed a cautious but genuine friendship. He often brought business questions to me, not about cooking, but about ethics and decision-making in situations where the right choice wasn't the profitable choice. His new real estate company was smaller than his father's empire, but more sustainable, focusing on projects that served communities rather than just maximizing returns for investors. "You taught me something I should have learned earlier," he told me during one of our conversations. "Success that comes from stepping on other people isn't really success at all. It's just accumulation with a hidden cost that eventually comes due." Charles and Eleanor, according to the occasional updates I received, had settled into a life that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow on the inside. Charles's business continued to generate enormous wealth, but his relationships with his children remained strained, and his health problems persisted. Eleanor maintained her social activities and charitable work, but she had never recovered from the damage to her reputation or developed the capacity for genuine self-reflection that might have led to actual change. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened if they had simply apologized when the truth came out, if they had acknowledged their mistake and worked to make genuine amends. But I had learned that some people are too invested in their own version of reality to admit when they're wrong, too proud to acknowledge when they've hurt someone, and too afraid of vulnerability to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. Their loss was ultimately deeper than mine had been. I had lost a job, income, and security, but I had retained my integrity and eventually found a larger purpose. They had retained their wealth and status, but had lost the possibility of genuine relationships, the satisfaction of honest work, and the peace that comes from living in alignment with your values. As I approach my 75th birthday, I find myself reflecting often on the unexpected journey that began with an accusation in a marble kitchen and led to a life I could never have imagined. The woman who once felt invisible now has a voice that reaches thousands of readers. The cook who was dismissed as adequate now teaches others and preserves culinary traditions that might otherwise be lost. The employee who was discarded without a second thought now advocates for policy changes that could protect countless other workers. But perhaps most importantly, the woman who once measured her worth by other people's approval now knows that her value doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition. I learned that dignity is something you carry inside yourself, not something others can give or take away. I learned that truth has power, even when it seems like lies have won. I learned that love is stronger than status, that integrity is worth more than wealth, and that the hands that nourish others are never truly invisible, even when they go unrecognized. The cooking classes I teach have become a cornerstone of my community. Every Tuesday and Thursday, women of all ages gather in the community center kitchen to share recipes, stories, and the kind of wisdom that can only be passed directly from one person to another. We make everything from traditional holiday dishes to simple weeknight meals. But what we're really creating is connection between generations, between cultures, and between women who understand that food is one of the fundamental languages of love. Last month, we had a special session focused on comfort foods, the dishes we turn to when we're sick, sad, or just need to feel nourished. Each woman brought a recipe and the story that went with it. There was chicken and dumplings from a grandmother who made them during the Depression, rice pudding from a mother who served it when her children were sick, chocolate chip cookies that had soothed 3 generations of family heartaches. As we cooked together, we also shared the stories of the women who had first made these dishes for us, mothers who had worked multiple jobs but still made sure there was something homemade on the table, grandmothers who had stretched ingredients to feed large families during hard times, aunts and neighbors who had stepped in when biological family couldn't or wouldn't provide the care we needed. These recipes, I told the group as we tasted each other's comfort foods, are more than instructions for making food. They're instructions for making love edible, for turning simple ingredients into security, for creating the taste memories that will comfort your children long after you're gone. One of the younger women in the class, a mother of 2 small children, raised her hand. But what if I don't have family recipes? What if I'm the first generation trying to create traditions? It was a question I heard often, especially from women whose families had been disrupted by war, immigration, addiction, or poverty. The assumption that everyone inherits a clear culinary lineage ignores the reality that many people have to create their own food traditions from scratch. Then you get to be the grandmother, I replied. The recipes you perfect, the meals you create for your children, the traditions you establish, those become the foundation for the generations that follow. Every family food tradition started with one woman who decided to make something special, to put love into a pot, to create comfort where none existed before. The woman smiled, and I could see her imagining herself as the beginning of something new rather than the ending of something lost. It's a transformation I've witnessed dozens of times in these classes. Women realizing that they have the power to create the traditions they wish they had inherited, that their kitchens can become the source of the food memories they want their families to have. This understanding of each woman's potential to create, rather than just preserve traditions, has become central to my teaching philosophy. While I emphasize the importance of learning from the women who came before us, I also encourage each participant to see herself as a link in a chain that extends both backward and forward in time. My second book, Feast Days, was published 3 months ago to reviews that were even more positive than those for Invisible Hands. The book tour took me to cities across the country, from community centers in small towns to large auditoriums in major metropolitan areas. At each event, I met women who saw their own experiences reflected in the stories I had collected, who felt validated in their own family food traditions, and who were inspired to document and preserve the culinary wisdom they had inherited or created. But the most meaningful part of the tour was the conversations that happened after the formal presentations. Women would approach me with tears in their eyes, holding worn recipe cards or sharing photos on their phones of family gatherings centered around food. They would tell me about their own invisible hands, mothers, grandmothers, aunts who had nourished them with more than just calories, who had created the taste memories that still provided comfort decades later. One woman in Chicago told me about her Polish grandmother who had died without teaching anyone how to make the pierogi that had been the centerpiece of every family Christmas. "I've tried every recipe I can find," she said, "but nothing tastes like hers." I think I lost more than the recipe when she died. I lost the connection to that part of our family history. Another woman in Seattle shared her struggle to maintain her Korean mother-in-law's food traditions while raising children who preferred pizza and hamburgers to the carefully seasoned dishes that required hours of preparation. "I know I should be preserving these recipes," she said, "but it's so much work and my kids complain whenever I try to make traditional food. How do you balance honoring the past with meeting your family's current needs?" These conversations reminded me that the work of preserving food traditions isn't simple or automatic. It requires intention, effort, and often the willingness to adapt traditions to changing circumstances. The woman whose grandmother's pierogi recipe died with her needs permission to create her own version, to experiment until she finds something that honors the memory while creating new experiences for her own family. The Korean-American mother needs strategies for introducing traditional foods gradually, for finding ways to make them appealing to young palates, and for understanding that cultural preservation sometimes requires cultural evolution. Part of what I try to offer in both my books and my classes is practical wisdom for these common challenges. How do you modify a recipe when you can't find traditional ingredients? How do you scale down recipes designed for large families when you're cooking for just a few people? How do you preserve the essence of a dish while accommodating dietary restrictions, food allergies, or changing tastes? But more importantly, I try to offer emotional support for the deeper challenges of carrying forward family traditions while creating space for innovation and adaptation. The guilt that comes with changing a family recipe, the pressure of being the designated keeper of culinary traditions, the grief that accompanies the realization that certain dishes will die with their creators because no one learned to make them in time. These emotional aspects of food traditions are rarely discussed in cookbooks or cooking shows, but they're central to women's experiences in their kitchens. We carry not just recipes, but the weight of family expectations, cultural identity, and intergenerational responsibility. We're expected to preserve traditions while also meeting contemporary demands for convenience, variety, and dietary accommodation. My own journey from employed cook to written cook to cookbook author and teacher has taught me that honoring food traditions doesn't require perfect preservation of every detail. It requires understanding the love and intention behind the traditions, adapting them to current circumstances, and passing forward the understanding that food is never just about food. It's about caring for each other, creating connection, and ensuring that no one goes hungry for either nourishment or affection. As I work on the early notes for what might become a third book, I find myself drawn to exploring the intersection of food and healing. Not just the obvious connection between nutrition and physical health, but the deeper relationship between cooking, eating, and emotional recovery. How do we rebuild after betrayal? How do we create new traditions when old ones have been damaged? How do we nourish ourselves back to wholeness when the world has treated us as disposable? These questions arise from my own experience, but they extend far beyond my personal story. Every community, every family, every individual has experienced some form of loss or betrayal that requires the slow work of healing. Food can be part of that healing. The soup that eases grief, the family meal that begins to rebuild trust, the new traditions that mark new beginnings. I think about Emma and Michael, who experienced the disruption of their relationship with someone they loved, and how cooking together became a way to rebuild connection while acknowledging that things had changed. I think about Maria, who risked her job to bring me the truth that set me free, and how sharing meals became part of how we expressed gratitude and friendship. I think about Sarah, whose struggle with cancer taught both of us about the difference between surviving and thriving, and how learning to cook for her own healing became part of her recovery process. Food alone doesn't heal trauma or repair damage, but it can be a powerful tool in the process of rebuilding. The act of cooking for someone communicates care and attention. The ritual of sharing meals creates opportunities for conversation and connection. The preservation of food traditions maintains links to identity and history, even in the midst of change. But perhaps most importantly, the work of nourishing others, whether through cooking, growing food, or simply ensuring that no one at your table goes hungry, connects us to something larger than our individual struggles. It reminds us that we are part of an unbroken chain of humans who have cared for each other through the simple but profound act of sharing food. This understanding has shaped not just my writing, but my entire approach to life in my 70s. I am no longer the woman who defined herself primarily through her service to others, who measured her worth by other people's satisfaction with her cooking. But I am also not someone who has rejected the value of nurturing or the importance of creating comfort for the people I care about. Instead, I have learned to balance caring for others with caring for myself, to offer my skills and knowledge while also maintaining boundaries, and to find joy in nourishing people while not depending on their gratitude for my sense of self-worth. It's a balance that took decades to achieve and continues to require conscious attention. The transformation hasn't always been smooth or linear. There have been moments of doubt, periods of anger, and times when I wondered whether fighting for my dignity had been worth the cost. The confrontation with the Morrison family required calling on reserves of courage I didn't know I possessed, and the years of rebuilding afterward demanded energy I sometimes wasn't sure I had. But looking back now, I can see that every difficult step was necessary. The false accusations forced me to confront questions about my own worth and the value of my work. The period of unemployment and near homelessness taught me the difference between needing a job and needing to be needed. The process of researching and writing my books connected me to thousands of other women whose experiences validated my own, while broadening my understanding of the challenges we face collectively. Most importantly, finding my voice as a writer and advocate allowed me to transform my individual experience of injustice into something that could benefit others. The Morrison family may have intended to silence me permanently when they had me escorted out of their penthouse, but their cruelty ultimately led to my voice being heard more widely than it ever had been during 15 years of quiet service in their kitchen. Not every story of workplace injustice or personal betrayal ends with book publications and speaking engagements. Most women who experience what I experienced never get the opportunity to tell their stories publicly or to see their accusers held accountable. My outcome was unusual, shaped by specific circumstances: Maria's witness, my daughter's support, my own willingness to risk everything for the truth, that don't exist in every situation. But what every woman in a similar situation does have is the same choice I faced: whether to accept others' definitions of our worth or to insist on our own dignity, whether to internalize shame that belongs to our accusers or to stand firm in our knowledge of who we are, whether to let injustice define us or to transform our pain into purpose. These choices aren't easy, and they're not always immediately rewarded. Standing up for yourself often costs more in the short term than staying silent. Insisting on your worth sometimes means losing security, relationships, or opportunities that might have continued if you had simply accepted mistreatment. But the long-term cost of not standing up for yourself is the loss of something that can never be replaced: your own integrity and self-respect. The Morrison family took my job, my income, and my reputation, but they couldn't take my knowledge that I had never stolen anything, my memories of the love I had poured into every meal, or my understanding of my own character and values. That inner knowledge was what sustained me through the months of unemployment and the years of rebuilding. It was what gave me the courage to confront my accusers and the wisdom to forgive them while maintaining clear boundaries. It was what allowed me to transform my experience into something that could help others rather than something that simply hurt me. The woman I am today, 75 years old and still learning, still growing, still creating, exists because of that inner knowledge. Age has taught me that external validation is nice, but internal validation is essential. Other people's opinions of my worth fluctuate based on their needs, moods, and prejudices. My own knowledge of my worth remains constant as long as I continue to act in alignment with my values. This lesson extends far beyond individual resilience to broader questions about how we value different kinds of work and different kinds of people. The Morrison family was able to discard me so easily because our society makes certain categories of workers, older workers, domestic workers, women in traditionally feminine roles, effectively disposable. We don't protect these workers adequately under law, support them with social services, or recognize their contributions to family and community well-being. Sarah's advocacy work with dignity and service has shown both of us how systemic these problems are and how much work remains to be done. Individual success stories like mine, while important for hope and inspiration, aren't enough to address the underlying issues that make such injustices possible in the first place. But individual stories are part of how broader change happens. When one woman finds the courage to speak her truth, it makes it easier for other women to speak theirs. When one family's cruelty is exposed and condemned, it establishes that such behavior has consequences. When one worker's dignity is acknowledged and protected, it raises the standard for how all workers should be treated. My story is ending now, at least this particular telling of it. But the story of women standing up for themselves, insisting on their worth, and transforming their pain into purpose continues in every community, every family, every workplace where someone decides that her dignity is not negotiable. Tell me in the comments, what's your story of finding your voice after being silenced, your worth after being discarded, your dignity after being dismissed? I read every comment, and I promise you that your experience isn't invisible to me. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul, loves without counting the cost, and deserves to be seen for the treasure she is. For more emotional stories about finding strength in unexpected places, click on the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey from the shadows to the light. Until our next story, remember that your hands are never invisible to the people whose lives you touch with love. We'll see you soon in the warmth of our shared kitchen of the heart.